The Demographic and Development Challenge of the Century, by Politopoulos, from a conference on Sub-Saharan Africa organized by the Political Science and Public Administration Alumni Association of the University of Athens, at the Greek Ministry of Foreign Affairs, in February 2016. The present English version is an expanded version of the original Greek.
Let's start with the most obvious and basic, well-known fact.
Africa's area is very large.
You can fit China, India, the USA, Japan and the European Union in it.
It is rich in natural resources.
It has 60% of the uncultivated arable lands of the planet.
Its area was always large,
but it was thinly populated.
This is changing rapidly.
SSA, Sub-Saharan Africa, Black Africa, covers approximately 4/5 of the continent.
This varies depending on whether Sudan is included or not.
SSA, including the Sudan, had less than 200 million inhabitants in 1950.
It has 1 billion today, and according to the median projection of the UN,
is expected to have more than 2 billion in 2050
and to approach 4 billion in 2100.
According to the same median projection of the UN,
world population will reach 11.2 billion by 2100.
SSA will have 4 billion,
Europe including Russia only 650 million,
and North America only 500 million.
1 in 3 inhabitants of the planet will be a sub-Saharan African, 1 in 2 of those aged 15 to 64 years old.
I have presented these projections several times in the last few years, and I'm always met with surprise and disbelief. You cannot know, Harry, what will happen in 50 or 100 years. My first mission to Africa took place 43 years ago in 1972 to Zambia. The white girl in the photograph is my first daughter, Galatia. Zambia had at the time 4.5 million inhabitants.
Greece had 9 million.
Zambia has today 18 million inhabitants.
Greece has 11 million.
Galatia has not had any children. Her friends in the photograph have 3 or 4 children each, and some of them 5, 6 or 7.
The demographic behavior of the children of those children will change. The UN projections take this into account.
They make reasonable assumptions about the probable drop in the fertility rate, high, middle and low drop. The diagram shows 5 and does not correspond exactly to the latest UN projections, but the broad picture is correct.
We use the most probable one,
the middle one. It is true, nevertheless, that when speaking about the population of the year 2100, we are speaking mostly about unborn people.
Only those who will be aged 85 years old or more have already been born.
When, however, we consider the year 2050,
all those that will be aged 35 years or more have already been born.
Our projection has a much smaller margin of error.
The difference between high, middle and low scenarios is much smaller.
When examining the population aged 15 to 64 years in the year 2035,
19 years from now,
we are no longer dealing in projections.
We are speaking about reality.
At least as far as births are concerned.
Only those that will be born in the next 4 years are missing.
In the year 2035, Sub-Saharan Africa, not the whole of Africa,
just Sub-Saharan Africa, will add to its population aged 15 to 64
more people than the entire rest of the planet put together. How many? 100 million.
That same year, the rest of the planet will only add 50 million. Let us repeat this. This is not a projection. This is today's reality.
Half of the population of Nigeria is aged 18 or less.
20 years later, in the year 2055,
SSA will add 130 million to its population,
and the rest of the world will lose 50 million.
This is a projection, a short-term projection with a low margin of error.
This diagram of the IMF based on the 2012 revision of the UN population prospects,
shows change in the working age population aged 15 to 64 from 1950 to 2100.
Sub-Saharan Africa is red, the rest of the world is light green.
After 2050, change in the rest of the world is negative.
In Sub-Saharan Africa it is positive to the end of the century.
That is what I have called
the demographic challenge of the century.
Let's now come to the second part, the development challenge of the century.
For 2 to 3 decades after the end of colonial rule,
SSA was getting poorer.
The rate of growth of the GDP as a whole and of one of its most critical components,
food production,
was slower than the rate of population growth.
After the end of the Cold War, around 1995,
SSA enters a period of sustained economic growth
of the order of 5% per annum,
almost double the rate of population growth.
Food production is also rising faster than the population. Per capita food production is rising.
Nevertheless, the absolute number of poor people facing basic nutrition and health problems continues, unfortunately, to rise in SSA because of the rapid population increase.
But they represent a diminishing percentage of the total population.
If economic growth continues at the recent rate,
the absolute number of poor people will also start falling.
SSA also continues to import food and seek food aid.
But if food production continues to grow faster than the population, this will stop. SSA will become self-sufficient.
In the last couple of decades, most indicators show unquestionable progress.
Literacy is rising.
Diseases are receding.
Child and maternal mortality are falling.
Life expectancy is increasing.
A rising percentage of the population lives in cities where more people have electricity,
watch television,
have vaccinations, etc.
For those familiar with the UN's Human Development Index, which combines the well-known per capita income with indicators about health and education, to produce a more accurate overall index of well-being, SSA's index rose 30% between 1990 and 2014, Norway's only 11%.
SSA is obviously much poorer than Norway, but if development continues at similar rates, the gap will close. Will it continue? Pessimists point out that SSA's growth has been mostly exogenous. There was a significant improvement in the security situation due to the end of the Cold War. Chinese demand sustained high prices for raw materials for a long time.
And there has been a small but significant inflow of foreign capital.
Is all this changing?
People speak today of a new Cold War.
The Somalian drama is affecting a large part of Eastern Africa.
The thoughtless Western intervention in Libya
has created a black hole of terrorism that is being exported to Western SSA.
Global and especially Chinese slower growth
have reduced the prices of raw materials.
Foreign capital is leaving the emerging markets.
Optimists take a longer view.
Point out that the global crisis cannot last 84 years
and that the fundamentals of SSA remain very strong,
unlike Europe's.
Thomas Piketty, in his famous Capital in the 21st Century,
predicts that the long-term rate of the GDP growth in aging Europe cannot exceed 1% to 1.5%.
And I will dare predict that SSA will have a long-term rate of GDP growth of 4% or more.
Why?
Because SSA will be gaining population in the productive ages of 15 to 64, whilst Europe will be losing it. Because SSA has natural resources to exploit that Europe does not have. Because SSA has so many basic needs that have simply been fulfilled in Europe. Because SSA has vast room to improve productivity.
This is the reasoning behind some well-known forecasts, predicting that the total size of the Nigerian economy will overtake that of Germany's around the middle of the century, and that the size of SSA's urban markets will be twice that of European markets by 2050, and 5 times bigger by 2100.
We are talking about a tectonic geopolitical shift.
Some examples to illustrate the gap to fill.
In Congo-Kinshasa, the SSA country with the third largest population and the size of France, Germany and the UK combined,
90% of people do not have electricity.
In Nigeria, the country with the largest population and economy of SSA,
Corn yields are a tenth of what they are in France.
irrigation, fertilizers, pesticides and much know-how are missing.
Much of what little is produced is lost in the journey between farm and table.
Roads and vehicles, storage and distribution facilities are missing.
Nigeria is exporting crude oil and importing gasoline and fertilizers.
Some investments that can resolve these screaming inefficiencies and injustices have started.
Others are programmed and all will take place one way or the other, sooner or later.
A pessimist might counter that the world does not invest according to need, but according to ability to pay, and that I am confusing demand with effective demand. How will the Congolese pay for electricity if we do finally invest in the famous Inga 3 dam?
The South African industry will buy the electricity to produce gold and diamonds, to export to New York and London.
Isn't there a better way to use the world's resources?
Well, we need to manage global aggregate demand in a different way.
We need to replace quantitative easing for the rich with quantitative easing for the poor, in fact the poorest.
Politically insane, completely utopian.
What is the alternative? World War III that Pope Francis predicts? I don't want to imagine what will happen if external or internal, political, military or financial upheavals push SSA back to the 70s and 80s, if the 100 million new workers of 2035 cannot find work.
SSA needs peace and stability.
It can put to good use its vast labor force if more capital is flowing in than flowing out.
And it can thus contribute to world peace and prosperity.
Its economy, so tiny today, can one day be larger than the American and European economies put together.
The American and European economies put together? Grandpa has lost it. What is he talking about? He is comparing the chaos of 49 African countries with the USA, with its 200-year-old stable democratic institutions, and with 28 European countries that have gone through fire and hell to get where they are today.
Go back 1 century. If some grandpa was telling you at the beginning of the 20th century that China would one day have a much bigger economy than Great Britain, that was ruling half the planet at the time, what would you tell him? To take his pills right away? If he told you that illiterate peasant Russia would build a society, a leading protagonist of the 20th century? If he told you that the European powers that fought each other in 2 world wars would construct a union where every European could be able to live and work wherever he liked in Europe? I am not claiming that SSA's economy will certainly be, at the end of the century, bigger than the economies of the US and the EU put together. But I am claiming that with triple land and quadruple population of working age, this is at least feasible. I'm really saying a very simple thing. People, so-called human resources, matter. Their quantity and obviously their quality. SSA will be the richest part of the planet in people of working age. Richer than China and India put together, much richer than the US and Europe put together. We have, of course, said nothing about immigration. We will leave that for another talk. The quality of SSA's labor force is already improving and will continue to improve rapidly with the advance of electrification and urbanization. If not the whole of SSA, at least some of its countries are destined to play leading global roles in the 21st century. The development of SSA is the central challenge of the 21st century. Its most important bet, and we must not lose it. Little Greece and Greeks around the world must use their small powers to support peace and development in SSA and to claim their fair share in this cosmogony, the creation of a new cosmos.
Σας ευχαριστώ.